Welcome to Digging Deep, the podcast where we offer bereavement bites for time-pressed professionals. I'm Heather Kiteley, second-generation funeral director and president and CEO of GFD. Today on our podcast, we have my very dear friend, Bill Denning. Bill is a fourth-generation funeral director in southwestern Ontario. Along with his family, he operates Denning's Funeral Homes Limited, a group of funeral homes, transfer services, and crematorium. He also volunteers his time as an operator of the not-for-profit Rodney Cemetery, so hey, he can add cemeterian to his moniker. Bill was asked to join GFD's Pre-Need Advisory Committee way back in 2009 by his mentor Jim Price, who was board chair at the time. Bill became hooked on GFD, became a board member in 2015, and was a board chair of GFD during a time of transition. And Bill and I worked very closely together, guiding GFD through all of that. He enjoys serving the profession through his efforts with GFD, and I am so excited to have you on our podcast today. As you said, Bill, we have been doing this together for decades, talking about funeral service and the things that are important to us and what we think is important to the sector. So welcome.
Thank you so much. I am so thrilled to be here with you.
Yeah, this is awesome. We are going to dig deep right from the start. So, what do you think we need to do to breathe life or new life into what you refer to as a dying industry?
Yes, and the dying industry is the industry of death. So let's make that clear that there's hope, absolute hope for this profession that is in the midst of significant change.
Well, you and I have talked about that a lot, right? That during a time of what feels like negativity or change, or every time you turn around something's happened, certainly through the pandemic, how throughout all of that there's so much optimism. So can you unpack that for me?
You know what? Every single generation of funeral director has been faced with this exact same problem. Nothing stays the same. People's preferences are constantly changing. Here's the rub. We get really, really good at what we do as funeral directors. We spend years and years practicing our craft, getting really good at the nuances of dealing with grieving families and offering the services and the products that they expect. But here's what happens. The next generation it consistently looks at things differently than their moms and dads did. And so what we find is that people are starting to ask for things that are maybe just a little bit different. And instead of looking at that and saying, okay, well, maybe we can adapt this way, I think a lot of times the first reaction of the funeral director is, what, you don't like what I got? And
Are you rejecting me, right? Is
exactly,
it a personal thing?
Right? So once you get over that, if you can get over that, then you can start looking at, using your skills and your abilities to actually help modify the services to meet the needs of the next generation. How do we do that? Well, all we do is what we do every day as funeral directors. We just listen. A funeral arrangement essentially is a consultation where we sit down with a family that has lost somebody, and they tell us all about the person that they've lost. They're telling us the story. And I think sometimes as funeral professionals, we're not listening to the story. We're just waiting. Don't bore us, get to the chorus, right? We got to get the date of birth. We got to get the vital statistics information. We got to get all of that information aggregated so that we can do the forms that they have to sign.
It's almost like our intro, right? Like it's the thing that we can ask that we're comfortable with, and it gets things started.
And it can't be the intro.
Yeah.
It can't be, because we really can't have good, meaningful conversations with these families until we've established trust, until we've built a friendship. So how do we do that? Well, I tell my staff all the time that when you're preparing for your funeral arrangement consultation with a family, you're going to go into the office, you're going to set it up, you're going to make sure that the coffee's ready, you're going to have your file there, you're going to have your little notepad, your pen. But what you're not going to do is you're not going to touch that pen for the first 15 minutes of that visit. You need to sit with that family and ask questions. Tell me about who you've lost. Tell me about your dad. Where was he from? What was important to him? And tell me about his favorite car. What was his first dog's name? All of these questions, so that you're not only you're building rapport, excuse me, but you're also actually gathering content about who this person is, so that when you get down the road into the nitty-gritty of this funeral arrangement and the important decisions that need to be made, you've got some ideas, you've got content to apply into the idea making process. So once you have essentially got to that point where you're talking to a family about, do you want to have traditional burial in a casket? Do you prefer cremation? Those are important decisions, but really the most important decision now is how do you want to honor this person that you've lost?
It's interesting because I was chatting with Michelle Clinton about this, and she was talking about that word honor, right? How that word honor she feels more effective than the word celebrate. And I think what you're talking about is really important because we're also chatting about all of the things that have to be done, right? Like how funeral service today is vastly different than funeral service, in my dad's time, your dad's time, or your grandfather's time, right? And how do you help people with those decisions? And if you don't know anything about them, then it's like this big giant menu of all the stuff that you have to try to go through. But if you can find out things about them, then you can help guide them through that menu. Would you agree with that? Is that kind of what you're thinking about behind the motivation for changing how you approach it?
Absolutely, and guide is a really great word. The word funeral director, which is the title of what our profession is, and something we're really, really proud of, but it just does not stick these days because nobody wants a funeral, right? The F word, no good, right? It's a celebration of life, it's a ceremony, it's a gathering, but the word funeral denotes mourning the loss. And we, as a society, have shifted from mourning the loss to wanting to celebrate the life. We've shifted from a negative to a positive. So if we're still trying to ram funerals down people's throats and they don't want it, and then we're surprised why they don't want it, well, we're the ones that are the problem.
And you and I have talked, we're both a bit of history buffs in this sector, and you and I have talked about this a lot, about how this is not new for funeral service, right? Even the word funeral hasn't been around forever. I mean, as a profession, we once called ourselves undertakers. In some places, they still call themselves morticians. I can only imagine back at the turn of the century, how all of the undertakers were sitting together in a room and saying, but I'm an undertaker. I don't want to not be an undertaker. With the other folks over here saying, but we need to become funeral directors, right?
Yeah.
Because people need direction. This is what I think we as a profession have been navigating since the beginning of time. As people's views change and shift, we just simply listen. To go back to your first point, which is the most important, we listen to what people are saying and then we adapt and we change. And we've done that over and over again to reinvent what funeral service looks like for the needs of the generation that we're serving.
This is a really great reminder for our profession right now that we're not the only ones dealing with this change. For the last 100 years, as you pointed out, undertakers, morticians, funeral directors have been forced to change. Spanish flu. It was the first time that when people would pass away at the home, that the undertaker would actually take the body out of the home and bring the body to their funeral home to do the embalming for purposes of
revolutionary at that time and crazy, and yet we think today that's how it's always been done.
Right. And then during the Depression, before the Depression, 80% of Canada lived on the farm, 20% lived urban, and because of the Depression and people moving from the farms into the urban centers for work and for food, all of a sudden people were living in smaller homes. They were living in apartments. They didn't have the big farmhouse with the parlor to have the visitation. And so funeral directors adapted, they pivoted by buying homes that had parlors and called them funeral parlors.
And imagine the discussion at the time, right? Like everyone's like, oh, now we have to have homes.
Exactly, like they were trying to create an environment that was reflective of what they remembered. And then interesting thought, the parlor in the family home, they didn't call it a parlor anymore. Once undertakers built funeral homes, they called it the living room because we don't put dead people in there. Not anymore, anyway. So every generation has been faced with these challenges and they have had to adapt. And it's a great reminder for our profession that we are again at one of those crossroads right now where consumers are questioning the value of how we help them cultivate meaningful ceremony. We're still really good at picking people up that have died.
Yeah.
We're still really good at sitting with families and helping guide them through the decisions of which cemetery to go to or which casket to choose. Those are skills, because having those conversations with somebody who's just lost the most important person in their life is not easy. So because we have those skills, we can use the talents and the abilities that we already have and inject that with a little bit of creativity into helping them craft a meaningful farewell for their loved one.
Yeah.
And how do we do that? Well, we already have all of the information that we need to help them, which is that first 15 minutes of that arrangement where we've really taken the time to learn about their mom or their dad or their brother or sometimes their child.
Too often.
Too often, absolutely. And so when we get to that end of that conversation where we're now talking about how to properly honor their dad or their mom with the ceremony, we can use our skills as funeral professionals to say, you mentioned to me earlier that your mother loved those scratch tickets. You know what? Maybe I'll go down to the variety store and I'll get 100 of them and I'll tape them to the bottom of the chairs. And on the day of the service, at the end, we'll tell everybody to look under their chair and we can all do a scratcher for grandma. Those sorts of, or down to the dollar store to get those cheap little frames because you told me that this one black and white picture of your dad was his most favorite picture. Let's print it 100 times. We'll pop it in those frames, and people can take those home with them. Rarely does a family or people who come in to pay their respects remember the color of the casket, but they'll remember how you made them feel by taking those few extra little steps to remind them that you do care and that you do want them to have a positive experience during the most difficult day of their lives. We're not magic. We're not.
There may be a little bit of magic.
Well, maybe just a little bit. But all we're trying to do, all a good funeral professional is trying to accomplish, is make the worst day of somebody's life perhaps just a little bit better with a little bit of kindness.
So, I obviously couldn't agree more with everything that you said. But I want to dig a little deeper here because when you say it as eloquently as you just did, and as simply as you just did, it makes it sound easy, right? Makes it sound like, we just listen and here it goes. Let's talk about what reality actually looks like. You have staff that you have to manage, you have facilities that you have to manage. How do you help support your staff through this transition and through having the freedom and the space to be able to make that magic happen for families without worrying about making mistakes?
Well, freedom's expensive. We're going to put that out there. We have a vision, my brothers and I, about what we want to do in the time that we are in this profession. And we have ideas of how to support and encourage our staff to help us to create that vision. And really how we're doing that is by giving our team the amount of space that they need to have those sorts of meaningful conversations with families without having to rush them, which is sometimes hard, because we all get busy in the funeral business.
Yeah.
But also the perimeters that they also require in order to feel safe and supported and structured.
It's got to be hard though, right? Because by our very nature, as funeral directors, we are so risk adverse. We're so afraid of making mistakes because you only get one chance at it, right? I think that is deeply ingrained in our psyche, and in order to do the things that you're talking about, we're going to have to take risks.
Yep.
So you give them time, you give them space. What else do you do?
In professional baseball, if you're batting 300, you are an excellent ball player. That's 300. That's 3 out of 10.
You're talking to
hits,
like a non-baseball person.
400, batting 400, you're excellent. So
Okay.
You're not going to get it right every single time. And yes, there is risk in taking risk.
Yeah.
But
we're
every
so
now
afraid,
and then,
right? We're like so.
we're terrified.
Yeah,
We're terrified because we
especially
don't want to
younger
upset
ones,
anybody.
right? It took me decades to be able to be a little bit comfortable with taking some risks.
In funeral service, we are afraid of doing something that exasperates the grief,
Yeah.
as opposed to helping heal that grief.
Yes, yeah.
But if we are taking risks because we truly in our heart want to help a family, we've taken the time to learn about them, we feel like we've made a connection, and we have some ideas, we're using our skills to create some sort of special moment within that ceremony. And the family understands that all we're trying to do is help. The risk is minimized because they're seeing that there's caring there. So is it always going to be perfect? Is it always going to be a slam dunk? No. But, and I'm talking about from a perspective of somebody who's been doing this a really long time and literally taking the risk multiple times without even telling the families what I'm going to do.
Oh my gosh, right? Like I'm thinking about some of this crazy stuff that you've done as a celebrant.
Right. Now, that's not anything I would, some of the things like dressing up as Elvis to do the eulogy, or, putting...
Which, for our listeners, Can you find that online? No, you can't find
Yeah, I think I've got it somewhere.
it. Yeah. It's like totally worth it.
This lady was palliative, and she told her family that her last request was to have Elvis do her funeral. Now, we're not sure if that was the medication talking or what that was, but they told me about this, and I called an Elvis impersonator to see if he could come to do the funeral, and he was not available. So my colleague, and at the time our general manager, Sean, who's an absolutely incredible human being, she didn't ask. She told me that I was doing the funeral as Elvis, and she went to Party City and got an Elvis costume, came back and threw it at me and said, put this on. And again, so back to the idea of collaborating and supporting your team and working as a team to create this meaningful ceremony. What we've tried really hard to do is encourage our staff to help support us in creating meaningful ceremony and doing the same thing for them. So that's a perfect example of all of the efforts that we've made, not just talking, but actually doing, getting out there as owners, as managers, as the leaders of the organization, and putting ourselves out there and assuming some of that risk ourselves so that we're not just asking, our team members to do it.
Yeah, like leading by example, right?
Exactly.
Right. Okay. It's not surprisingly, we're out of time. So we're going to do a lightning round.
All right.
So I'm going to ask you questions, and you need to give me like 1 or 2 word answers.
Okay.
Top 2 most effective changes that you made in the last 3 years at your funeral homes.
Okay, well, that's a good one. Okay, digital transformation. So online digital calendars for scheduling of events. That would be a big one.
Yep.
And dumbing down our dress code.
Oh my gosh, our whole podcast topic in itself, right?
More casual.
Really? How casual?
The client, the family, tells us what we're wearing on the day of the funeral.
Like you asked the question?
We ask the question. Do you want us in jeans? Do you want us in Canadian tuxedos? What do you want? How can we make you feel comfortable?
That's brilliant. So for our listeners, I want you to imagine that somebody's listening to this podcast who is just starting out in funeral service. Top 2 pieces of advice for them.
Be open-minded. Have thick skin, because there's going to be people who are going to be upset and they're going to be hurt, and it's inadvertently going to land in your lap.
Oh, it totally reminds me of a story of when I was starting a funeral service and going to extra effort to personalize the funeral. And one of my managers said, "Why do you have to make it so hard? Why do you have to make it so complicated?" That is a great piece of advice. Yeah.
Well, and that's certainly some older thinking, because, and again, that manager is just being protective of everybody's time and trying to keep that well-oiled machine moving. At the flip side, the second piece of advice I have for new people in the bereavement sector is follow around those old dogs and those old girls and listen to how they converse with families. Their mannerisms, their nuances. There's so much you can learn from people who have been in funeral service for so long about how to effectively communicate with grieving families. And I'm not talking about necessarily the most important parts of the discussion about burial information, just how they talk to families about the weather. There is a skill, there's a craft to it. So listen and learn from those that have been around a long time. But then, once you've done that, create your own style and be authentic.
I think that is an amazing place to close, right? Because as much as everything is changing, so much is staying the same. And those skills that you develop over time in this sector, those people skills, those are the things that are going to outlast any changes to preferences or whatever else might come. So it's a wonderful place to close. Bill, thank you so much for being here. I feel like we are definitely going to have you back because we could talk for ages.
It's been fun.
Stuff. It has been so fun. This concludes this episode of Digging Deep. I want to thank Bill Denning for joining me today. Again, my name is Heather Kiteley, President and CEO of GFD.